Hello, friends. Welcome to my channel. How many words did you read today? A message on your phone, a sign on the street, the subtitles on a video, maybe an article, a menu, a label on something in your kitchen. You read without thinking about it, the way you breathe, automatically, constantly, without noticing that you are doing it at all. Now imagine that you cannot. Not because you lack intelligence or curiosity or the desire to know things, but because the words were never made available to you, because the only copies of important texts in your city lived behind the walls of a monastery or university, accessible to a tiny circle of scholars and priests who decided on your behalf what you needed to understand about the world. Imagine growing up in that world, not as an exception, but as the rule, as the experience of almost every human being who had ever lived. That world ended in a workshop in Mainz, Germany, sometime in the 1440s. A goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg pressed ink onto paper using a mechanism borrowed from wine production, and without fully understanding what he was starting, he cracked the structure of power that had held for 1,000 years. Here's the thing, though. Power does not disappear when you crack it. It moves. And where it moved next, and what it did to the English language along the way, is a story that is still unfinished. Before Johannes Gutenberg built his press, a book was a miracle of human labor. Monks spent years copying texts by hand, one letter at a time. A single Bible could take a skilled scribe more than a year to produce. One book, just one, was worth as much as a house. Think about that. The knowledge inside a book was so difficult to copy, so expensive to own, that most people never touched one in their entire lives. Literacy, the ability to read, was not a right. It was a luxury, like silk or gold, reserved for those with money or power or both. The church controlled enormous libraries. Universities guarded their texts. Kings had scholars. Everyone else had stories passed from mouth to mouth. Information that changed each time it was repeated. Truth, that bent depending on who was telling it. Gutenberg changed all of that with a screw. He adapted a machine used for pressing grapes into wine, a simple lever and screw mechanism, and combined it with something new. Movable type. Small metal letters, individually cast, that could be arranged into words, pressed onto paper with ink, and then rearranged to print something else. It was not the first printing technology in the world. China and Korea had explored similar ideas centuries earlier, but Gutenberg's system was fast, precise, and suited perfectly to the alphabet-based languages of Europe. By around 1455, his workshop had produced the Gutenberg Bible, not one copy, hundreds. The church did not panic immediately. At first, the press seemed useful. Religious texts, reaching more people, spreading the word of God further and faster. But then, something else started happening. Ideas that the church had suppressed, questions it had answered with authority for 1,000 years, started appearing in print, and printed words spread differently from spoken ones. You could argue with a priest, you could silence a voice, but you could not unprint a page. This is where the story gets complicated, because the printing press did not only spread good ideas, it spread every kind of idea. Pamphlets, arguments, accusations, theories, heresies. The word that meant dangerous religious beliefs flooded Europe. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther wrote 95 criticisms of the church, questions about money and power and corruption. Before the press, those arguments might have circulated slowly among scholars over decades. Within weeks, printed copies were in the hands of ordinary people across Germany. Within months, across Europe. The Reformation, the great splitting of Western Christianity, had begun. Not because of Luther alone, but because a machine made his words impossible to contain. The powerful tried to stop it. Books were banned. Printers were arrested. Certain texts were placed on official lists of forbidden reading. But here's the thing. You cannot ban an idea that has already been copied 10,000 times. The press had changed the rules of the game, and there was no going back. If you enjoy watching history change in real time, consider subscribing. There is always another door to open. Now, here is the part that most people do not expect. The part that connects directly to the English you are learning right now. In 1476, an Englishman named William Caxton set up the first printing press in England. He had a problem. English at this time was not one language. It was dozens of regional dialects, ways of speaking so different that a person from the north of England could barely understand someone from the south. Words were spelled differently in every city. There were no rules. Language was alive, shifting, local. Caxton had to choose. Every book he printed needed to use one version of English, one spelling, one set of words. He chose the dialect of London and the Southeast, the dialect of the court, of trade, of power. And then he printed it. Thousands of copies. The same words, the same spellings, the same grammar reaching readers all across the country. Can you imagine what that did to language? For the first time, English began to freeze. Not completely, not overnight, but the press applied enormous pressure toward a single standard. If you printed a word one way, and that book reached 10,000 people, that spelling became familiar, then normal, then correct. And some of those spellings were already old when Caxton printed them. The word night, for example, was once pronounced with a hard K at the beginning and a guttural sound in the middle, something closer to the German Knecht. By the 1470s, educated Londoners had already stopped pronouncing those sounds, but Caxton printed the old spelling anyway. And so it was fixed, locked in. The word changed in the mouth but stayed the same on the page. That is why, 500 years later, you write night, but say night. The press preserved a spelling that the spoken language had already left behind. The same is true for ghost, wrong, knife, right. Silent letters that are not mistakes. They are fossils, evidence of sounds that existed once, before the press held the spelling still, while the pronunciation kept moving. Before we reach the end, drop a comment below. Do you think new technology always makes the world more free? Or does it just change who holds the power? Think about what happened next. The press made books cheaper. Cheaper books meant more readers. More readers meant more demand for education, for ideas, for argument. The scientific revolution of the 1500s and 1600s, the era when Copernicus said the Earth moves around the sun, when Galileo watched the moons of Jupiter, was not separate from the printing press. It was powered by it. Scientists could share discoveries across countries. Ideas built on each other faster than ever before. A theory published in Italy could be read, challenged, and extended by someone in England within months. The press did not cause all of this, but it made all of it possible. It created the conditions. A world where knowledge moved faster than authority could silence it. And English? English kept spreading with every new book, every new pamphlet, every new idea pressed onto paper. The language absorbed Latin words, French words, Greek words, folding them in, expanding its vocabulary in ways no spoken language could have managed as quickly. Today, English has more words than almost any other language in the world. The press is a large part of the reason why. So what did the press actually change? Everything, you might say. And that is true. But here is the part that is harder to sit with. The church lost its monopoly on knowledge, but governments found new ways to control what was printed. Censorship did not end. It modernized. The index of forbidden books, the licensing of printers, the burning of pamphlets, these were not the last attempts to manage what people were allowed to read and think. They were the first modern ones. The press did not destroy the relationship between power and information. It rewrote the terms. And English, The language that Caxton standardized, that the press froze into spelling rules and grammar that made no logical sense, became the language of trade, of empire, of global reach. That is partly because of the press, and partly because of what the press made possible. A literate, organized, expanding England that carried its standardized language into places it had no right to go, and left it there. The words you are using right now, the spellings, the silent letters, the vast vocabulary absorbed from Latin and French and Greek, are not neutral. They carry the marks of every hand that shaped them, a goldsmith who needed money, a printer who had to choose one dialect over another, a church that wanted control and lost it, a set of empires that wanted something else entirely,